Picture this for a moment. You're the most devout Christian in medieval Europe. You wake up every morning at 4 a.m. for prayers. You've memorized entire books of the Bible. You donate half your income to the church. You fast so regularly that your neighbors worry about your health. And you've never missed a single Sunday service in your adult life. You're basically a walking saint by medieval standards. But here's the part that will shatter your illusions about medieval piety. By the end of an average day, you've committed at least 5 mortal sins that, according to church doctrine, have damned your soul to eternal hellfire. Welcome to the reality of medieval Christianity, where the church had created a system of moral standards so impossibly high and contradictory that even the most genuinely faithful people were guaranteed to be constant sinners. Where being a good Christian wasn't about avoiding sin, it was about managing the guilt of inevitable sin through an elaborate economy of confession, penance, and spiritual terror. Today, we're diving into the 5 sins that were so fundamental to human survival and basic social functioning that even the most pious medieval Christians, saints, monks, bishops, and devout lay people committed them regularly while living in constant fear of damnation for behaviors they literally couldn't avoid. Prepare to discover why medieval Christianity created believers who were more psychologically tormented than spiritually fulfilled, why the church's moral system was designed to guarantee failure rather than encourage virtue, and why many of the period's most celebrated saints were secretly some of the most prolific sinners, according to their own religious standards. Because after this story, you'll understand that medieval piety wasn't about moral purity. It was about surviving in a religious system specifically designed to make moral purity impossible while extracting maximum psychological and financial control from believers who could never be good enough to earn salvation on their own. Let's start with something that will immediately demonstrate the impossible standards of medieval Christianity: the sin that every single person, including the most devout monks and nuns, committed multiple times every day simply by being human. The sin of impure thoughts that included everything from sexual awareness to anger, from envy to pride, from doubting God's wisdom to enjoying food too much. Medieval church doctrine held that Christians were responsible not just for their actions, but for every thought, feeling, and involuntary mental response they experienced. Sexual thoughts, angry thoughts, envious thoughts, proud thoughts, doubting thoughts, and even thoughts of enjoying earthly pleasures were all classified as mortal sins that damned the soul regardless of whether they led to any external actions. The theological reasoning was that since God could see into human hearts and minds, having sinful thoughts was equivalent to committing sinful acts in the presence of the divine. A monk who experienced a moment of sexual attraction, a nun who felt pride in her devotion, or a lay Christian who doubted God's justice during times of suffering were all equally guilty of mortal sin. But here's what made this standard psychologically devastating. These thoughts and emotions are automatic functions of normal human psychology that cannot be consciously controlled. Medieval Christians were being held morally responsible for involuntary brain chemistry, evolutionary responses, and basic emotional reactions that occur in all mentally healthy humans. The confessional manuals of the period contain detailed catalogues of thought sins that reveal the impossibility of the standards. The manual Summa Confessorum lists over 300 different types of impure thoughts, including feeling momentary irritation at slow service during Mass, experiencing physical attraction to anyone other than one's spouse, feeling satisfaction at completing religious duties well, and wondering why God allows suffering to exist. Saints' autobiographies reveal the psychological torture this created. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote extensively about her constant guilt over impure contemplations that included everything from admiring beautiful church architecture to feeling frustrated with other nuns' behavior. She developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, spending hours daily attempting to purify her thoughts through repetitive prayers and self-flagellation. But perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from monastic records that show even the most dedicated religious professionals couldn't meet these standards. The Journal of Brother Thomas of Aquinas, kept during his time at the monastery of Monte Cassino, documents his daily struggles with thoughts he considered sinful. This morning I felt pride when the abbot praised my copying work. This afternoon I experienced anger when Brother Benedict spilled ink on my manuscripts. This evening I had lustful thoughts when I remembered my life before taking vows. Each thought damns me anew, yet I cannot prevent their arising. The psychological impact was devastating. Medieval Christians developed what we would now recognize as religious trauma, living in constant fear that their natural human thoughts were evidence of spiritual corruption. Many became obsessed with thought control, developing anxiety disorders, depression, and self-destructive behaviors in futile attempts to achieve impossible mental purity. The Church had declared all forms of usury, defined as any profit gained from lending money, to be mortal sin equivalent to theft from God. This prohibition extended beyond simple interest to include most forms of commercial profit, speculation, and even saving money for future needs rather than trusting in divine providence. The theological basis was that time belonged to God alone, so charging interest was essentially stealing time from the divine. Additionally, making profit from others' needs was considered a form of exploitation that violated Christian charity. The Church taught that true Christians should lend freely, give generously, and trust God to provide for their needs without accumulating wealth. But here's the reality that made this prohibition impossible to follow. The entire European economy was built on credit, interest, and commercial profit. From the smallest village transactions to the largest international trades, economic life required forms of financial activity that the Church classified as mortal sins. Even the most pious Christians had to engage in these sinful practices to survive. A devout farmer who sold grain for more than it cost to produce was technically committing usury. A faithful merchant who transported goods and sold them at higher prices was exploiting others' needs. A religious family that saved money for emergencies was demonstrating lack of faith in God's provision. The hypocrisy was most visible in religious institutions themselves. Monasteries operated extensive commercial enterprises, charged rent on their properties, lent money at interest to local communities, and accumulated vast wealth through investments and speculation. The Abbey of Cluny operated a banking network that spanned most of France, charging interest rates that often exceeded 25% annually, while publicly condemning usury as damning sin. Records from the Vatican archives show that the Papal States operated sophisticated financial systems that included currency exchange, international lending, and commodity speculation. Pope Innocent IV, who issued some of the strongest condemnations of usury, simultaneously borrowed money at high interest to finance his political campaigns and lent papal funds to Italian city-states at rates that would make modern loan sharks envious. Devout laypeople developed elaborate mental gymnastics to reconcile their economic activities with their religious beliefs. They redefined interest as gifts of gratitude, profits as compensation for risk, and savings as stewardship of God's blessings. But these rationalizations couldn't eliminate the psychological burden of knowing they were constantly violating fundamental Christian principles just to participate in basic economic life. The most tragic cases involved genuinely pious merchants and craftsmen who genuinely tried to follow the Church's teachings about commerce. Records from medieval guild archives contain numerous examples of devout Christians who attempted to conduct business without profit, charging only enough to cover their costs. Most of these businesses failed rapidly, leaving the owners destitute and unable to support their families, creating a new moral crisis about whether starving one's children to avoid commercial sin was virtuous or sinful. Now, if you're finding these impossible moral standards as psychologically disturbing as they are historically important, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more revelations about how religious institutions created systems designed to ensure constant guilt and dependence. Medieval church doctrine classified eating beyond the minimum necessary for survival as the sin of gluttony, but their definition of gluttony was so broad that it included virtually any form of enjoyment related to food. This wasn't just about overeating. It was about experiencing pleasure, variety, or satisfaction from meals. The Church taught that since humans were fallen creatures with corrupted appetites, any desire for food beyond basic nutritional necessity was evidence of spiritual weakness. Enjoying the taste of food, looking forward to meals, eating anything more flavorful than necessary, or consuming food at times other than those required for health, were all forms of gluttony that demonstrated excessive attachment to earthly pleasures. The standards were impossibly specific. St. Thomas Aquinas identified 5 distinct types of food-related sin: eating too much, eating too eagerly, eating food that was too expensive, eating food that was too delicious, and eating food that was prepared too elaborately. Under these definitions, almost any normal relationship with food became spiritually dangerous, but humans are biologically programmed to find eating pleasurable and to seek variety in their diets. The sense of taste exists specifically to help humans identify nutritious foods and to make eating rewarding enough that people will consume adequate nutrition. Medieval Christians were being asked to override fundamental biological programming that was essential for health and survival. The psychological torture this created is evident in the writings of medieval saints and religious figures. Saint Catherine of Siena developed what modern medicine would recognize as severe anorexia nervosa, eating so little that she frequently fainted during religious services. She wrote extensively about her guilt over experiencing any pleasure from food, describing eating as feeding the beast within, and viewing hunger pangs as righteous punishment for past gluttony. But even Saint Catherine couldn't completely eliminate food pleasure. Her letters reveal constant guilt about moments when she found meals satisfying. "Yesterday I consumed bread with what I fear was enjoyment rather than mere necessity. I have spent the night in prayer, begging forgiveness for this corruption of appetite. How can I claim to love God when I take pleasure in His creation, rather than using it purely as medicine for my mortal flesh?" The hypocrisy was most evident in religious feast days, when the same church that condemned food pleasure mandated elaborate communal meals as religious obligations. Medieval Christianity included dozens of feast days throughout the year, when communities were required to celebrate with special foods, abundant meals, and shared dining experiences that necessarily involved the very food pleasures that were otherwise classified as sinful. Monastic communities developed complex rules attempting to navigate this contradiction. Some monasteries mandated that food be prepared as blandly as possible to minimize pleasure. Others required monks to eat in silence, while listening to readings about the spiritual dangers of appetite. Some communities practiced alternating days, where monks would fast completely one day and eat normally the next, hoping to balance spiritual purification with biological necessity. But the records show that even in the most austere monastic communities, food pleasure was impossible to eliminate. Kitchen records from medieval monasteries reveal that even communities supposedly practicing severe food restrictions regularly consumed varied, flavorful, and abundant meals. The monks simply experienced constant guilt about enjoying them. One of the most psychologically destructive aspects of medieval Christianity was the classification of spiritual pride as a mortal sin. This meant that feeling satisfaction, accomplishment, or confidence about one's religious devotion was itself a damning sin that could negate all the spiritual benefits of that devotion. The Church taught that since all good works came from God's grace rather than human effort, taking any credit or feeling any pride in religious accomplishments was essentially stealing glory from God. A Christian who felt satisfied after completing prayers, confident after performing charitable works, or pleased about their spiritual progress was committing the sin of pride, which many theologians considered the worst of all sins. This created an impossible psychological trap. Medieval Christians were required to pursue spiritual perfection with total dedication, while simultaneously never feeling any sense of achievement about their spiritual efforts. They had to care deeply about their relationship with God, while never taking pride in their devotion. They had to work constantly on moral improvement, while never feeling progress. The psychological torture this created is evident in the writings of medieval mystics and saints. St. John of the Cross wrote extensively about the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual despair that he considered necessary for true holiness. But reading his detailed descriptions, it becomes clear that much of this despair came from the impossible demand to pursue spiritual excellence while never feeling good about spiritual achievements. When I pray with fervor, I am guilty of taking pride in my devotion. When I fast successfully, I am proud of my self-discipline. When I give generously to the poor, I feel satisfaction in my charity, and this satisfaction damns me more surely than if I had kept the money for myself. How can one serve God without taking any pleasure or pride in that service? Yet to take such pleasure is to worship oneself rather than the divine. The practical results were devastating. Many genuinely devout medieval Christians developed what modern psychology would recognize as religious scrupulosity, an obsessive-compulsive disorder focused on religious perfectionism. They became paralyzed by the fear that any positive feeling about their religious practice was evidence of damning pride. Some attempted to solve this problem through extreme self-deprecation, constantly declaring themselves worthless, sinful, and unworthy. But this created a new trap. They would then feel proud of their humility or satisfied with their self-criticism, creating new forms of pride about not being proud. Others attempted to eliminate all emotional responses to their religious practice, trying to pray, fast, and perform charitable works with complete emotional detachment. But this often led to spiritual dryness and depression that made religious practice feel meaningless and burdensome. The most tragic cases involved people who abandoned religious practice entirely because they couldn't figure out how to be devout without being proud of their devotion. Records from medieval confession archives contain numerous cases of people who stopped attending church, stopped praying, and stopped charitable giving because they believed their inevitable pride in these activities was damning them more surely than simple neglect would. Medieval church doctrine classified all forms of anger as mortal sin, including anger at injustice, anger at wickedness, and anger at suffering, emotional responses that most people would consider morally appropriate and psychologically healthy. This prohibition extended to feeling indignant about corruption, frustrated with evil, or upset about harm done to others. The theological reasoning was that since God controlled all events, becoming angry about circumstances was essentially questioning divine wisdom and justice. Additionally, anger was considered a form of pride, the assumption that one's judgment about right and wrong was superior to God's mysterious plan. But anger at injustice is a fundamental human moral emotion that motivates people to protect others, fight corruption, and work for positive change. Medieval Christians were being asked to suppress the very emotional responses that make people care about justice, compassion, and moral improvement in society. This created particularly devastating conflicts for people in positions of responsibility. A Christian judge who felt angry about criminal defendants lying was committing sin. A Christian parent who felt indignant about someone harming their child was damning their soul. A Christian community leader who felt frustrated with corruption was demonstrating spiritual failure. The writings of medieval authorities reveal the psychological contradictions this created. St. Augustine, one of the most influential church fathers, wrote extensively about his struggles with anger. Yesterday, I witnessed a merchant cheating a widow of her last coins, and I felt rage rise within me. But this rage itself was sin, for it demonstrated my lack of faith that God would provide justice in his own time and way. Yet how can I witness injustice without emotional response? Am I to become so spiritually dead that others' suffering moves me not at all? The prohibition against anger created particular problems for people working in law enforcement, military service, and social reform, roles that necessarily involved confronting wickedness and fighting injustice. Medieval Christian knights, judges, and civic leaders lived in constant psychological torment, knowing that the emotional responses necessary for their duties were simultaneously damning their souls. Some attempted to solve this by acting against injustice while trying to feel nothing about it, creating a cold, detached approach to moral issues that often resulted in cruel indifference to suffering. Others tried to replace anger with sorrow, feeling sad rather than indignant about wickedness, but this often led to depression and despair that made effective action impossible. The most psychologically damaging aspect was that many devout Christians began to see their moral intuitions as evidence of spiritual corruption. When they felt angry about cruelty, frustrated with dishonesty, or indignant about exploitation, they interpreted these feelings as proof that they were spiritually defective rather than recognizing them as signs of healthy moral development. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by the psychological torture that medieval Christianity inflicted on even its most sincere believers, definitely subscribe for more insights into how religious systems can create the very problems they claim to solve. But here we arrive at the most important realization about these impossible moral standards. They weren't designed to create better people or more virtuous societies. They were designed to create psychological dependence on religious authorities who claimed to be the only source of forgiveness for inevitable moral failures. The medieval church had created a system where even the most genuinely good people were guaranteed to be constant sinners, requiring constant absolution, guidance, and intervention from religious professionals. This wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system's most important feature. By making normal human psychology, basic economic activity, biological functions, emotional health, and moral intuitions into sins, the Church ensured that everyone, no matter how devout, generous, or well-intentioned, would need constant religious services, regular confession, frequent penance, and ongoing spiritual direction. The psychological torture experienced by medieval Christians wasn't an unfortunate side effect of high moral standards. It was a deliberate feature, designed to create believers who were too psychologically damaged to trust their own judgment, too guilt-ridden to feel confident in their own goodness, and too dependent on institutional forgiveness to imagine spiritual life outside church authority. Historical records show that the communities with the strictest enforcement of these impossible standards also had the highest rates of religious anxiety, spiritual despair, and psychological dysfunction. But they also had the highest rates of church attendance, religious donations, and submission to clerical authority. So there you have it. 5 sins that even the most pious medieval Christians committed regularly because they were either biologically necessary, psychologically inevitable, economically required, or morally appropriate responses to human circumstances. These weren't moral failures of individual believers. They were the predictable results of a religious system that defined normal human functioning as spiritual corruption and then offered itself as the only solution to the problems it had created. The next time someone speaks nostalgically about the strong faith or clear moral standards of medieval Christianity, remember that this system created believers who were psychologically tormented, spiritually insecure, and constantly dependent on institutional authority for basic emotional stability. Remember that truly healthy spirituality should help people become more confident in their moral intuitions, more psychologically stable, and more capable of independent moral reasoning, not more dependent, more anxious, and more self-doubting. And remember that recognizing these patterns is crucial for identifying when modern religious or political authorities attempt to use similar tactics, creating impossible standards that guarantee failure and then positioning themselves as the only source of relief from the guilt and anxiety they've created. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to appreciate the fact that I can have normal human thoughts, engage in economic activity, enjoy a good meal, feel satisfied with my accomplishments, and get angry at injustice without believing these natural responses are damning my soul to eternal torment. Because after exploring the psychological torture chamber that medieval Christianity created for even its most sincere believers, I think we can all be deeply grateful to live in an era where spiritual health is measured by psychological well-being rather than psychological dysfunction. And if you made it to the end of this exploration of medieval religious trauma, tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. We are fascinated to know that these insights about historical religious psychology are reaching people around the world who understand the importance of distinguishing between healthy spirituality and systems designed to create dependence through manufactured guilt.